I'll officially call the meeting to order. I do have a script, so just for the record, today's January 16, 2024, here in Coachella. Prior to roll call, I'd like to make clear for the record of this meeting that it should be reflected in the minutes that at least a portion of this board meeting is conducted pursuant to California Government Code Section 54953, in that Director Nelson is in Shafter, California, and will be participating by speakerphone. In accordance with the Ross M. Brown Act, the teleconference location has been identified on the agenda for this meeting. Maricela. It says Clerk Bermudez, but I'm going with Maricela. Will you please call the roll?
Yes. Good morning. President Powell.
Here.
Vice President Estrada.
Here.
Director Bianco.
Here.
Director Aguilar.
Here.
And Director Nelson.
Here.
Thank you.
Good. I'd now like to request that Director Nelson respond to the following questions. Director Nelson, can you hear me well?
I can hear you just fine, John. Thank you.
Great. Did you fall into the bottom of a well? Because you sound like you're... That's not the second question. Were you able to hear our proceedings on this end up until now?
Yes, I have. Very well.
It does sound like he's at the bottom of a well. Do you have a copy of the agenda for this meeting?
I do.
Have you posted the agenda at the location?
It's posted, and there's no one here to participate.
Okay. Is your location reasonably accessible to the public, such that any member of the public could participate in this teleconference from your location if he or she wished to do so?
Yes.
And you've already answered 6. There's nobody there with you. All right. Good. Thank you. Let's see. I guess we're going to do the Pledge of Allegiance next. Please stand and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay. Is there anyone from the public wishing to make comment at this time? We do have some public here. Don't see any. Okay. So we do have one item on the agenda. This is a study session, so there will be no action taken. The item is on 4A, options for stormwater funding. And I'm guessing Rick is going to take this item.
Yes, sir. Well, good morning, President Powell and members of the board. So as was stated, this item is to provide a broad overview to you all and to the public of what the major options are for funding, what is a pretty significant need, which we'll go over on our stormwater infrastructure going into the future. And so there we go. It's really prompted part of a series of conversations staff and the board have had, starting with Tropical Storm Hilary, the September 1st storm, both 1 in 1,000-year storms, and the impacts that our communities had from those, leading to an overview engineering provided in November of the future projects and their scope. But out of that, the highlight was the bill for the future is significant. That was quantified by engineering for future projects at about $1.4 billion, and that being in today's dollars, and that gets to be very significant when looking at projecting what this will cost in the future. And so we have $1.4 billion is the total CIP bill for the future, and what those projects represent are what it takes to either extend our regional stormwater protection to areas that don't have that now, or to get what we do have up to the standard 100-year flood protection level. What that number doesn't include is any capital replacement needs. Fortunately, those tend to either be minimal or done through O&M on stormwater, or any of the local flood control infrastructure. I know there were articles even this week, I believe one of the local municipalities getting an $8 million grant. That doesn't cover anything that they need to do. So this is purely just regional stormwater. The problem really comes to highlight when you look at what we have available to try and tackle this problem. And so currently that fund is, its funding source is ad valorem property taxes, which grow by a certain percentage per year. And so that's what we're limited to, is that percentage of growth. We've been fortunate to see this increase the last couple of years with almost 9% increases year over year, getting up to about $28.5 million. But when you consider between investment income on existing reserves and a little bit extra through some lease revenues and other sources, after we pay for O&M, what you're really talking about is about $15 million to pay for CIP. And you look at the long-term average in today's dollars and these projections, and let's say it's roughly $20 million a year that you have to try and chip away at that $1.4 billion. So the question came up in our previous conversations, well, just how long would this take? And then what are our options to do something other than that? And so that's largely what this presentation seeks to do, to provide some broad framework. And so the goal for today, at least from staff's point of view, is to give the major options on what it is to tackle that $1.4 billion, both looking at the major options within the board's control, being our existing revenues, the status quo, and then what we could do to reallocate existing property tax revenues from other funds, or at least the growth in those funds, not taking away anything that they have currently, or additional revenue options. And then, of course, that discussion revolves around taxes, and so we'll get into some detail on that. And then always can we get any grant funding? And so what are our major options for grant funding and sort of the likelihood that we could get anything on that front. So getting into scenario one, the status quo, on how long would it take? And so the short answer to get to it is give or take 10 years on either side, I think, is our reality window, until about 2090 is what it would take using our existing funding sources and what we would consider average assessed valuation growth. That's assumed at 4.25%. That really represents the average for the last 20 years, and that includes both COVID trends, Great Recession trends, growth and declines. It also represents what's the most typical number that we see, not only just the average. So it seemed a good number as any to look into the future. And the other major assumption, just to throw in here, and it really makes or breaks the overall number, is, well, how fast do these costs climb year over year? More recent years, we've seen this number jump significantly. Just about every time you look at a CIP approval, it's jumped. And so, but long-term averages are at about 3.5%. And so those really make or break these assumptions. But we know that we'll be wrong, but generally speaking, most of these assumptions go hand in hand with each other. They're based on the same underlying inflation sort of basis. And so I think they're relatively accurate as far as anything we could know now. And so what does this scenario really entail in terms of major assumptions? Probably the big one I would highlight from the beginning is that currently in our CIP plan, those existing projects and you hear me mention $100 million in debt we think we need to issue in 2026, which is right around the corner. 33 of that $100 million was dedicated for stormwater to afford certain projects on there. And that would be a pretty conservative funding level coming out of stormwater. We would be able to keep, I think, our AAA rating. If we wanted to fully leverage our existing revenues, you could take that 33 up to 150 million to accelerate some projects, and then expect that our credit rating is going to dip a bit. But it would get to about a level that I would call the sweet spot. We mentioned that last year, maybe a AA negative. And so
Rick,
it's
is that based on the 15 million
the 15.
annual? Yeah.
Yes.
Imagine.
Yes. Yeah, the existing revenues and the growth that we would see over the next few years. So we have some excess capacity to issue more debt now. That's the main point there. And so what this analysis does is it looks into the future and says we could probably do 3 major debt issuances to try and accelerate paying off these projects. Each time that we would issue debt, we would max out our debt capacity in the time that we're issuing the debt. And then obviously you get a little bit more as the tax base grows and eventually we pay off the debt. And so it would take 3 major issuances to be able to do this. And then probably the other major assumption to draw attention to is and this whole analysis relies on this. So engineering handed me a wonderful projection of what years they needed, which revenues to try and fund this. And I tried to fit it into what we could do, and they don't align at all. I can't make it work. So you have to reverse this to say that we can phase the projects according to when we have the money. And that's probably a reasonable approach in some way, shape, or form, but just saying that does assume that we would have to restructure this according to funding availability, not based on the initial thoughts on when it was best to align the projects.
Rick, when you say that in 2026 we can handle the 150,
Mm-hmm.
why is that? Like, do we have a line of credit right now, or is that just on all the existing revenues and property tax, or how do we get to being able to handle that?
So right now we have enough excess property tax revenues over O&M, not already committed to existing debt service, that when we issued bonds, we could issue that amount without getting too big of a hit on our credit rating.
Oh, you mean just because we have big reserves?
Because we have enough property revenues, property tax revenues. And so the way that they look at is two major lenses. One is it's called debt service coverage. So
Okay.
once you take revenues, you take out our O&M expense, how much extra do we have to cover the debt service? And the other one is, as you're referring to, is reserves. How much do you have as a buffer and savings? And so this takes into account both of those. Is that we could, if we were willing to drop our credit rating a bit to look a little bit weaker, it would mean a slightly higher interest rate, but you could issue more debt. And so that's what this is.
So you're saying to complete these projects in 66 years, we would have to issue $150 million in debt 3 times?
No, just in 2026. It jumps up to about 440 million by 2056 and 520 million in 2056 and 1.5 billion when you look at 2086. But that's in future dollars, so it's much different if you try to convert that to today's dollars. Yeah, large issuances. Point being is you max out what you can in those years once you've paid off the prior debt.
But there wouldn't be anything left for anything else?
No,
No.
Not in the stormwater.
not in the stormwater. Yeah, so this
That
is
would do a lot. I mean, that would really do a lot.
right. So this is as fast as I could calculate using reasonable assumptions how fast we could tackle that list of projects. So that's the status quo. If we don't do anything else, we just let the tax revenues grow as they can, and then we maximize debt in the years when we can. So the second scenario is to say, well, what could we do within if we think district-wide and what resources are available? And so what this option does is it says, well, without taking away any property taxes we have in other funds, if we froze those amounts in place, and then we looked at whatever growth we saw in the future and we redirected all of that growth to stormwater, how fast could we do this? And that drops from 66 years down to 39 years. The presentation was updated. That did say 35 years. That's the only change in the slide there. There was a correction there. So about 40 years. And so that's a significant drop here, and that's the whole point is to say 39 years, and as I talk to engineering, and they can chime in on this, that may be a little bit aggressive given how fast it takes to tackle some of these things, as well as when you would need the project according to how development works out in the valley. So that seems about reasonable, as fast as you really could handle all of these projects in the scope of where they're at, not to say prioritizing certain projects which rise to the top of the priority list. But so it drops down to 39 years, and this essentially contains all the same assumptions, except because you have more revenues coming into that fund. You don't have to wait to the 2050s to issue debt again. You could issue more debt in 2040 and sort of knock this all out faster, and that's what this assumes.
So can you allocate funds from other pots to stormwater? That sounds kind of
So
risky.
the only property taxes which are fully restricted and not available to this. So the State Water Project tax is fully restricted. It can only be used for State Water Project contracts purposes. And we do have CFDs and assessment districts that we levy a tax. All of our other taxes are built into an allocation of the 1% general property tax that every property owner gets, including what used to be ID1 in Canal. That's not, we've talked about this, that's not an additional tax on property owners now. It used to be. And so, yes, our legal opinion now is that as long as it's part of the general property tax and the other funds, it's fully unrestricted, so you don't have to use it in that fund. And if we're just talking increment, it opens this up to being able to redirect the increment.
But you're gonna need those, funds to keep domestic things reasonable priced, or you're gonna have to raise all those.
Right. So,
Because, the projects, the CIP projects that we have in each one of those funds, those costs are gonna go up.
yes.
Yes.
Yeah, each fund has its needs, and so that's why this gets to what's the policy priority from the
Yeah.
board.
Yeah, are we willing to suffer rate increases on other funds in order to beef up the CIP on stormwater?
Yeah, I don't
And
think
then,
so.
and then the other one is, are we willing to raise a new tax? Which, at the end of the day, you're
Yeah.
gonna pay it somehow.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and that's what that in essence functionally does, is as you redirect some of the unrestricted property taxes to this fund, it acts like a tax on the other funds. So you're just imposing a tax one way or the other in function, not in legal substance. But so this is what you could do using existing revenues. And the drawback, as we were just talking about, is that then takes away those resources from the other funds. And so you no longer have those to mitigate rate increases in the other funds. To give some sense of impact of what that increment would be to the other funds, at the end of this 5-year period, it's about maybe a 2 to 3% rate increase difference on domestic. So if you redirected money to stormwater at the end of the 5 years, that money could have lowered increases on domestic 2 to 3%. That's the scope of magnitude on what we're talking about here.
Directing the increment.
That's correct.
But you have some going to Canal, you have some going, I think, to the east of that.
Yes.
So
And we have
that
some
would
on the
also,
west. I think is-
that would impact those funds as well.
Yes.
But you probably already accounted for that on the domestic?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So trying to boil a giant Excel model down to a couple slides of relevant information. What this graph looks to tell you is the difference in the scenarios. And so you have the baseline beige bars, which are the O&M projected expenses till 2096 that are common to both scenarios. Those don't change. The yellow and the red compare the debt service amounts year over year, the yellow being the status quo and the red being the accelerated funding with the additional property tax revenues. You can issue a little bit more debt up front. The blue behind the scenes is the status quo revenues from property taxes, well, all revenues. And then the orange shows you the value of the increment over time. So that grows, it compounds year over year. So it's not much in the beginning, but you throw out a couple of decades and it's significant enough to start really whittling down the CIP. In a different view, if you looked at the 1.4 as sort of a credit card bill, how fast can we pay off the bill? And so this shows how fast, according to the two different scenarios, blue being the status quo and then the orange being the accelerated funding. You see the trajectory of the decline being heavily influenced by when we issue debt. Essentially, you upfront cost a bunch of projects, you work on them heavily for a few years, and then you rely on pay-go leftover funding to whittle down the rest until you pay off your previous debt. And so just overall thoughts on the scenario 2, because we haven't talked about that, is it is the most flexible option for the board in the sense of discretion, because all of those revenues continue to be unrestricted over time. So for instance, if we dedicated revenues over to stormwater and 15 years from now we realize what CIP projects we needed to do, some of them need to be deferred so we have extra revenue, you can redirect those back to the other funds, both in the sense of the revenues and even the reserves. So that money doesn't go away. It's still available should you reprioritize your needs in the future. You're not locked in, is the big takeaway from this slide. But the other big takeaway being, as soon as you commit those revenues to offsetting rates, which is what we typically do every time we do a rate study, you've committed to using them in the future, because if you take them away, it's a rate increase automatically. And so if the board is interested in this direction, the sooner the better in not committing those funds to automatically offsetting rates. You can use them for one-time expenses or other strategic projects, but not annual expenses to offset. Otherwise, you're committing yourself. So that's it on the analysis. I'll stop there if there's any questions on the analysis itself. The rest of the discussion is on new revenue options.
The stormwater tax is a special tax, right? It's not part of the 1%.
It is part of the 1%.
The stormwater taxes?
Yeah.
Okay.
It used to be a separate tax, the same thing as the ID1. Now it's all wrapped into the 1%. So people don't pay more for stormwater. We do get more of a share of the 1% because of what we used to charge for stormwater, but people don't pay more for stormwater. It's just the 1%.
Maybe a comment, well, question first. These projects, the $1.5 billion of projects, I'm assuming the majority of that, well, probably most of it is in the East Valley. I know there's probably a fair amount in Cathedral City too, right? 2/3 of it in the East Valley, maybe? Yeah. And then about a third in the West Valley. I mean, I know it's a little bit of an artificial, but just getting back to the 3 to 4% domestic rate increase, roughly, if you reallocated those discretionary property taxes to fund the CIP, rather than to help those funds keep their rates low. The impact of that on domestic is, in my mind, significant, but maybe manageable. But we should at least have our eyes open to the fact that a lot of the customers in the East Valley don't pay our domestic rate. They're on India or Coachella, so they're not going to see that 3 or 4% rate increase. It might make sense to me as a put and take if that tax, the discretionary tax, were above the 1% and everyone paid it. But it's actually part of the 1%, so you're going to pay it whether it happens or not, because it's going to either go here or it's going to go somewhere else. So just something to keep in mind. I think it's, the idea that you're going to pay it either way, maybe, but I think our domestic customers are going to pay more than those that have other domestic providers. I mean, you could say the same thing for Myoma Dunes and all the other small providers out there. Yeah. Okay, just a comment.
Well, you have domestic customers that aren't paying property taxes too.
You're talking about who? Tribal?
Well, don't you have people who
Schools?
are paying domestic rates that don't own the property, who are paying?
Yeah, but the landlord's going to charge it, somehow collect that through the rent. I mean, there are some that don't pay tax, right? I mean, you have, we don't pay tax. Schools, tribal.
Yeah,
There's-
for tribal purposes doesn't.
For tribal purposes, yeah. So there are some that don't pay tax.
So I feel like when this changed, the stormwater tax was a special tax and now it's when did that happen? I feel like I missed it.
This probably was, it would have had to have been decades ago.
Okay, decades
Yeah.
ago.
You didn't miss it.
When
I just felt like
when Prop 13 was implemented, that's when all this was grandfathered
I'm
in.
trying to recall my bill, my tax bill, and I do recall seeing the state water project tax there as a special tax, but I felt like there was another special tax, and I don't know if that was the ID1 tax or other. So you're saying that other than the state water project tax, that's our only.
I think the
special
state,
tax?
Unless
I think
you're
the
in-
stormwater is listed separately though,
But
It is. There's something.
on the property tax. There's a CEWD on there. It may only be the state water project.
No,
tax.
There's state water project tax.
No, I think I've seen a.
so you're saying that the stormwater is wrapped up in the 1%.
Yes.
So if you raise the stormwater tax, how can you get more than the 1%?
That's what we'll get into
Because we have
Yeah,
in the next slide.
yeah. The only thing on there is going to be the state water project tax.
School
There's the
districts.
1%, yeah, the state water project tax, like, if you're in this area, CV Unified, which is actually higher than our state water project tax, believe it or not. And if you're in, I mean, if you're in a CFD, you would have that on there too, but that's pretty limited, and you would know if you're in
Yeah,
that.
maybe what it is, it lists everything that's hitting the 1%, and that's why I'm seeing other CBWD line items.
It just has the 1%. There's no other line.
I'm gonna
item
look
on
at a
it.
copy.
Hey,
'cause I-
hey, guys, I'm looking at my tax bill right now, and I'm not sure if this is part of the 1%. There's a general purpose tax, which is 1%. And then under the taxing authorities, I can see the CV Water District State Water Project. So I get that. That's 11%. But there's also a La Quinta Stormwater tax, which is pretty small. It's pretty small, but there is on there. That's not part of the 1%.
And that's not ours.
It's not ours, yeah.
So who is
Because you're in La
that?
Quinta.
Who's is that then?
I would assume that's the city of La Quinta's tax.
Yeah.
I'm a La Quinta resident, so that's where I was going. When I said it's on,
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure I saw stormwater.
It's not on, if you're not in La Quinta, it's not on your bill.
Yeah, it says Spicer Consulting. That's who you're supposed to call.
Give them hell.
Yeah, it's freaking $10.
Oh my God.
All right, so new revenue option.
Hang on, John, I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, Rick, in scenario one, we're talking about $150 million worth of coverage of debt based on that scenario, which is what you say here. And then on scenario two, with two issuances, what is the amount of coverage there? Is it twice that, or is it of the 1.4 billion? Are we talking?
So just to clarify, in scenario one, you have to do 3 separate issuances. Each issuance, at the time that you're issuing, you're going to max out your lien, which means you're taking out as much debt as you can based on the revenues you have at the time. Those issuances look something like this. In the first one in 2026, it's about 150 million. In the second one, in the 2050s, you're looking at about $500 million, but that's in those dollars in 2050s. And then the third one's about 1.5 billion in the 2080s. So again, those are future dollars, very different than today.
Okay.
In the second scenario, you issue a little bit more than the 150, or about 153 million in 2026, because there's a little bit more revenues available in that fund because you're moving some over. And then the second and last debt issuance, it's about 440 million. And that's enough between that and the PAYGO available funding to whittle everything down by the 39
Okay, that's
years.
awful. That's great. Thank you.
Okay.
Did I hear you say that that timeline is good because it would take that long to build the projects? Did I hear that?
No, I mentioned, that to say that that's when funding would allow you to build a project. It's not constructability, but it might be about as aggressive as you could get otherwise, even if you had all the money up front, just because of how complicated it would be and whether you would want to build all those projects
If
right
money
now.
were no object, it would still take
A long time.
decades to build these things. Yeah.
It wouldn't take 66 years.
Not that long.
No, but maybe we're talking 40, 39. Yeah, maybe you can squeeze it a little quicker. Huh, okay.
So, getting into the next section on new revenue options. And so this is really trying to address some questions that came up from the board in previous discussions. But if we wanted to leave our discretionary property taxes in their funds and deal with other priorities because we have other needs, and levy new taxes, so just some overall thoughts on new or increased taxes. So in each of these scenarios, we would have to go out for voter approval. because you're levying a new tax. Because right now we don't have a tax per se, we just have a share of the 1%. So we have an allocation of an existing tax. We don't have our own tax. So we would need to get voter approval to issue a new tax. Because we're a special district and it's a special purpose, that defaults within the legal framework to a 2/3 registered voter approval. The general statistics for special districts to pass these kinds of things are 40%, and that's with special districts that think that they're going to succeed by putting these on the ballot and doing voter research and surveys and all the rest. I mean, governments don't just go out without doing research and planning. So that's even with all of that, only 40% succeed. I was talking with a staff member this morning that the city of Paris just tried to do a warehouse tax that would only affect warehouses to fund roads because of the amount of truck traffic that the warehouses are causing. And that only got 55%, and that was voters not even getting a tax themselves. That was taxing somebody else. These are just really hard to pass. The big takeaway from this slide is to say there is a constitutional amendment going before voters this November that would lower that threshold to 55% to be on the same par as school districts and community colleges. So if you were at all interested in this, wait till November to know, till after the vote on whether you could take advantage of that option or not. And the other key takeaway, just to say with these kinds of taxes, because you're going out before the voters, and it's a very common sense thing, but it's true, especially from our office and how much work that it takes. There's a lot of advanced planning and communication necessary because with an ad valorem increase, and we'll get into this, you're asking for a specific authority to issue a certain amount of debt, which translates to the tax to repay the debt. And so you're going to the community to say, we want to build X, Y, and Z projects. There's an expectation that we're going to build them within a certain amount of time. You're talking about specific projects, not just a general tax. So you want to make sure you're communicating that well, and you have community support before you commit yourself to it.
What would it look like? How much would you pay?
Well, that all depends on which projects
You're doing.
we're
How you're
doing.
packaging it.
So you have 1.4 on the total list, but we're not, like we just mentioned, you're not going to build all of those right away. So you would take some subset of that as a priority, let's say 400 million, 500 million or something, just as an example. And that's what the ballot initiative would be, is do you authorize CVWD to issue up to 500 million in general obligation bonds? And then if you did, an estimate of your property tax might be X amount, based on the debt service
I'll
on
just
that.
say that COD did it twice and they were successful.
It's,
Right. At a 55% threshold, because that's what the threshold they have.
yes.
Oh, they have a lower
Yeah,
one?
that's
Yes.
going to be a big deal if
Yeah.
that thing passes.
Well, then we need to
That
wait for that.
changes. I can imagine, it's COD, I get it.
Education.
It's education, but a lot of people don't access education. And I'm thinking about the problem we're going to have. If you live in South Palm Desert, you already got your flood control, so why would you want to pay more so that somebody else could have it? I mean, that's going to be the challenge. And, there are a lot of, it tends to be the more heavily populated areas that have the flood control right now, because
They've already paid for it.
that's the whole point of, you want to go to where you're going to get the most bang for your buck. And so a lot of it's already been built, and those folks may be less inclined to, to want to pay more. Although, if you look at our state water project tax, it's 11% of the 1%, right? Is that right? And that generates 65 million a year.
A little over 90 now.
90? Oh yeah, things have gone up. So we don't need that much, right? That's not even in the ballpark of what we need. If you could bump this up by 20 million a year, how much do we need?
Well, so the 90 million now, if we're talking state water project, gets us up to our new reserve target, because we had talked last
Yeah,
spring
I'm not
that
talking
was
state
low.
water project. I'm just trying to see
Oh.
the magnitude of how much people would have to
Yeah.
pay for this project.
Next
gotta
slide,
be.
or next two slides,
Yeah.
I'll get into that. It's so if the state water project's 0.11%,
Yeah.
if we funded the full 1.4 billion, it would be 0.09%, so about 2 basis points difference. So it's about the same.
But that, for how many years though?
So that's just to give a ballpark sense of magnitude. That's funding the full 1.4 as if we could construct it all right now. just to say the debt service would be about another state water project tax. So it's going to be less than that number because we're not going to do the full 1.4.
No, yeah.
Would that be a 30-year bond?
That would be a 30-year bond.
Yeah, I mean, you could, that tax would be lower than that.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe 0.05. I mean, it's going to be, I would say, closer to half, because 40 billion a year, or 40 million a year is going to, 45 million a year is going to buy you a lot of projects.
It would.
If
So
you
yeah,
bond it
that
over-
was just to give a sense of a maximum.
Yeah, it's not going to be that much.
Yeah, if it were $500 million, roughly a third of the project, could we ballpark it at a third of the state water project tax?
Yeah, I mean, can we get a better number on that? It just seems like, I get it, it's a max, but we don't need all the money on day one, right? So,
Right. So it all depends on which projects you'd pick, but I could try and get you what a good metric to
yeah,
scale it
maybe
would be.
more a range of what that would be. Because there's a big difference between 0.05 and 0.09, you know, as far as what kind of impact that has on the taxpayer.
Yeah, right now, the state water project on about a $500,000 home is about $600.
A year.
Yeah. So this might be a helpful metric for you all. So our average single family resident home in the district is assessed at about $350,000. It's not their actual market value, but what the assessments come in at. And so our state water project tax at 0.11, so if you say 0.10, so it impacts an average single family residence about $350 to $370 a year. That's the actual impact on a normal property
It'd
tax.
be half that much.
So if it's half, I mean, you could probably make it half. So you're talking 200-ish a year.
Yeah, per year.
Maybe below.
We'd still need more than half the people to vote yes.
Oh, I know.
Yeah, I mean, you'd have to hire a PR firm and really pound the pavement like COD has done.
They had a campaign.
Yeah, you need a campaign.
Have we considered doing any kind of polling?
We would have
We
to.
wanna properly
We-
phrase
yeah,
the
we would have
questions,
to before
Yeah.
we do
But I
it.
think we would want to do that first.
Yeah, that would be that bullet point, significant advanced planning and communication. That's all part of that introductory work leading up to this.
I just don't, I mean, even after Hillary, which was a big deal, you know,
For a small part.
how many people in the valley really, and there's a difference between regional flooding and local flooding, because there's plenty of local flooding risks in the valley, but that's not what we're talking about. So you're talking regional flooding. How many people really, you know, go to bed at night worried about, you know, living here? I mean, I've been flooded, but it was a local flood, you know? It was horrible, but this wouldn't have helped. I just don't know that, you know, how do you create the need that people want to solve a problem that maybe doesn't touch them at all, you know?
I don't know that that residents know, like, to what extent we're exposed to, like, regional flooding issues, right? And I think that hopefully if we say that we have regional issues, that they would buy in, right?
Yeah.
That they would trust us enough to say, well, you guys know what you're talking about.
Yeah, it's
I-
all that stuff north of I-10 and the East Valley, right? I mean, that's where it is. Yeah, on both sides of the East Valley. How do you scare people, you know, or create the need? Education is obviously a story you can tell. I mean, not being flooded is a story you can tell too.
Yeah, there's ways to do it, I think. I mean, but I get your point, you know, it's the same thing with the schools, you know, why do I pay school taxes if I don't have kids going to school? Or
I think it may be worth it hiring someone to find out what we're all talking about. Is it feasible?
Yeah, would people vote to pay $200 or $300 a year for the next 30 years?
30, 40.
Yeah, I mean, if the moment we go out there, we go, hey, you don't need this because you already have it, then yeah, we're going to create the division. But we're not, I don't think that's the message we want to put out there.
I think we'd be hard pressed to find somebody who, as a consultant, wouldn't be willing to take this on.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Right.
But you
So, I
know,
mean, the validity of a pre-assessment,
No, I just want
Kinda
to
goes away.
I just want to do some polling to see.
Here's the
Are we
problem.
even in close? Are we even close? I mean, is it going to come back that 25% would say yes? Then we're not even close. I mean, are we
Right.
even close to
you know, here's the, maybe the difference between COD and what we're doing is COD, everyone is welcome at COD, right? I mean, it doesn't matter how old you are, what your socioeconomic, I mean, if you want to go take some classes, you can. And so everyone that lives within driving distance, it's a viable option. How are you going to, you can't say that about the flood control thing, because people already have protection, or their issues are not regional, they're local. So it's not for everybody, it's just for some people, and actually it's for a lot of people that aren't there yet. It's for growth, for people that are gonna be here in 20 years,
But
or
John,
30 years after we build this
during
thing.
Hillary, everybody in this desert had some kind of inconvenience. Whether you were driving somewhere or you had to prepare your house, that was a big thing.
It was, but how many of those issues were regional, and how many were local? I don't know the answer, but I think a lot of them were local. That, you know, it's not our purview. I mean, that $8 million that Palm Desert got, that's not regional, right? That's all that I-10 stuff. That's all local, and that was very disruptive, but it wasn't regional.
When you look at the financial records of the district and what we might consider large CIP projects that we've built over the years, do you have that? Do you have records of that? Have you been able? I mean, is it in your spreadsheets? Do we have a sense of how the fund has been used in the past to build these great, regional infrastructure projects?
I would say yes. I'm pretty sure we could go back and figure out how much stormwater money we've spent. Do you want to come to a microphone?
Yeah, I guess
you
I'm just trying to get the sense of how has the district handled these projects in the past, being that they're regional?
Sure.
And
So,
how, I mean, because we can't get to a point where all of a sudden it's like, well, one side of the valley's built and
yeah,
we don't care about the other side.
it's
I
built,
know.
but it's
We
built.
ran out of money.
It's
Yeah.
built to a 100-year protection. Upper Mission just had a 1,000-year storm. So just because you're protected in Palm Desert just doesn't mean you're still going to get inundated significantly with a major event. We've been lucky that we haven't got hit in the whole valley with 6 or 12 inches at the same time. It's been 1 or 2 different canyons. But La Quinta Cove, Rancho Mirage Cove, they were all done through a redevelopment agency through the cities. And we took them over at some point in time. But that's how they were funded in the beginning. In the 1980s, La Quinta went out RDA funding, and that's how that doesn't exist anymore.
No, I know.
So that's why the new structure has to be done. But and then the other thing is, the Isle of Travertine behind Dike 4, the Travertine Point. There are a lot of different things that were going to be the channels themselves that we would be regional. Were going to be funded by development. Just as recent as 5-10 years ago. I mean, they've been working on H&H for the Isle of Travertine behind Dike 4 for 15 years, trying to find a solution. And the problem is, it's $80 million up front to build a bunch of very nice end homes. And Travertine Point is 5,000 acres. That is the main 3 channels that would protect all of Oasis in itself. And it was going to be done at one point through the Travertine Point.
Yeah, at least for me, it would help me to know that, hey, this was built by developers, this was built by redevelopment money, this was built by us. And I think that would help me understand, what we've done and haven't done, and
Sure.
versus have this belief that,
Yeah.
oh, we did everything, and maybe that's not true.
Yeah,
we did
that's a
something.
good, I'd like to see that also.
Yeah, I mean-
Good point.
And
it's a long history of, I've seen pretty much all of it. I mean, South Palm Desert didn't have flood control.
CVWD built all that. Palm Desert, I believe.
I thought we did
Yes.
before my time.
Rick, I'm assuming that the initiative in November is a 2/3 vote.
So
Hey, John, I think your dad built that, to be honest with you.
Probably. I'll ask him. He did the La Quinta one.
I believe that's majority only to pass the constitutional initiative.
Really,
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting?
that is interesting.
You'd think you would need.
I would think just the opposite.
Logic would tell you it needs to be
Yeah.
2/3 to change the 2/3.
Yeah.
Well, there's another constitutional initiative also in November that would do that very thing, but I don't know that it would apply to this one. It would change the voting threshold based on what it would take to pass. And so this is to counteract another issue going on. But it would do that very thing, that it would change the voting threshold so that it's not majority to impose a new restriction. You would take, if it's 2/3, it would be 2/3. You'd need to vote for it. So there could be a lot changing this November on the entire scope of major voting thresholds.
So it's only a majority to pass this law that changes it back to.
Are you sure? I'm not.
That is
I'm not
crazy.
sure about that. That doesn't sound right.
Victoria, is that?
Fairly certain, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, because it's a constitutional amendment, and those take majority votes.
but
That's gonna pass then.
but if the legislature wants to change the Constitution, it's more than 50%.
Yes.
But if the voters do it, it's 50% plus one.
I believe it takes 2/3 of legislature. Well,
Yeah,
Yes,
it
yes.
is something like that. Yeah. Huh. All right.
so we'll see that this November, and that can change the whole landscape of what the options are. The last thing I was going to point out here is there are other options other than ad valorem. Actually, there's a lot of more options other than ad valorem as a special tax, and that in almost all of these options, we can either do things on a district-wide or specific area basis if we wanted to target specific projects that have, more,
benefits.
more local benefits. The difficulty, as we've been talking about, is most of these projects are going to be in undeveloped areas or areas with very low tax base. So that would just make the taxes probably
That much
not
higher.
feasible.
I
Yeah.
know. Yeah, I think it needs to be district-wide.
Right.
Yeah.
So you could separate it out.
You could, based on benefits to areas, or at least partially separate it out. There's options, is all I'm saying there.
So many of these areas either have low property values or very few people in them currently.
Right.
But the whole idea is, I mean, you can protect what's there, but you're really laying the groundwork for future growth.
Right.
You know,
Yeah, but you could just do all of the East Valley.
do all the East Valley, yeah, for $1 billion. I mean, that's what
Or
we're
you could
talking
just
about.
tax the East Valley.
The trouble is your tax base is going to be
A lot smaller.
a lot smaller, so you're going to be able to do much fewer projects. And so it gets to be a catch-22 sort of issue. And so if you try to rely on development, it's the same issue. The development's not going to happen until you build the infrastructure, but you can't bond fund for these projects until there's very reasonable expectation that this development's immediately going to happen. So it's just really not feasible.
You know, you can make the argument, I'll make the argument that the state water project tax has a greater benefit for the West Valley than it does to the East Valley. And so this would have a similar type tax structure, but with a greater benefit to the East than the West. So maybe in my mind at least, they could balance each other out somewhat.
I would agree with that. And I'm also, I think it's, I'm not too opposed to the idea of kind of offsetting the incremental to get us started if we need to kind of start soon. I know that you brought up the issues with what that would do to some of the other funds, but we're not moving all of it, we're just moving the incremental, so.
Right. And that's what I was trying to get at, is you can go through all of these hoops and potentially fail, very likely fail, on a number of these initiatives, or within your own discretion is move around some funding. And we're really talking about, because we're talking about impacting customers and residents either way, is a few % rate increase. I mean, that's what this comes down to, and being able to fund these projects within 40 years.
Every year, though.
Yeah, it's forever.
Yeah, every year.
Once it
That's
goes
the
up,
thing.
it doesn't come
So you
down.
raise it up, you would be raising the rates every year.
Not by an additional 2 to 3%. I was just giving the sense of the impact one time to the rates.
But then
yeah.
it stays there.
But it stays there, right?
So you're saying all the rates would go up 2.5%, and that would take care of all of this? Just a one-time 2.5%? That's not true.
3 to 4%.
Say it's 5%. That's not, that's not gonna raise that kind of money.
Long term, it could when it builds on itself. So the big point being, if our cost of service said we needed to raise rates by 5% by the end of this 5-year period, and we take away these revenues, that cost of service is now going to say you need to raise them by 7.5% to 8%, because you don't have those revenues available to offset. So that's
Yeah, I mean, exactly. So the problem is, we're not in a static situation. We know that rate increases are going to be driven by a lot of different things, and that we are going to have these sort of 5% a year type increases. So this would add on top of that. So now you're just almost kind of raising the starting point and then adding, and then you're going to still add all those
I see what you're saying,
5%
yeah.
on top of that. Yeah.
That's just to take care of the incremental tax that we would be
Yeah.
using.
so.
It's doable, though. I mean, it just, there's, I guess there's a lot of awareness of flooding, but there's no awareness of any of this, right? I mean, this whole idea of what are the projects and what's the need and how do you get from where we are today to building them? There's no awareness of that.
The idea that comes to my mind is, like, is there a number that would make us comfortable? Like, if we needed to have a goal of, we need to create this much reserve so that we're in a good place if there's ever a big enough development that happens that requires us to do some regional protection. What do we need to have in the bank to be able to be in a position to move on that? Is it 200 million? And at least have a target to beef it up to that level so that we don't get stuck, killing projects because we don't have the funding to do the project. I just don't know the magnitude of these projects, even when we talk about the list. I don't know if the average project is 200 million or 50 million. I don't have a sense of that.
No. Do you guys want to talk about that? At the very end of the PowerPoint, I tried to give you what the list looks like. So with the amounts in today's dollars, so you can get a sense of the magnitude of the different
Okay.
ones.
Thank you.
These are the same projects that were outlined by engineering in November. So there's nothing new on there. Some of them are much smaller, and some of them are very large.
Well, 100 million looks like a good number.
The big takeaway is, until you start allocating the increment, because increment's not very much in the beginning, you have to let it build over time. So the longer the decision is, then you're sort of handicapping ourselves in the long-term process. The sooner a decision's made, if you go in that direction, the more options open up over time. And again, to the degree that we're wrong in the future, and we have, she put it up. We have excess revenues. We don't need as much as we thought we did. You pull it back, or take those excess reserves and spend it on domestic CIP that's been unfunded or some other priority at the time.
I'm a little surprised that the status quo, we can do it in 66 years. I mean, honestly, I thought it would be a lot longer, if ever. I mean, I know 66 years is a long time, but, it's not forever. I mean,
Yeah.
it's actually, you start managing from there, managing back to where we are today. It seems like a solvable problem, actually, which I didn't think it was.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if it would be hundreds of years or what
Yeah.
was the scope. So
That's with $2 billion of debt.
Yeah, but it's not moving any money around. It's just doing what we're doing now.
So
The 66 years is based on spending 20 million a year or so.
Plus the big debt issuances.
Right.
Yes.
So it's based on a money value, not necessarily a staff resourcing standpoint. I just want to point out our canal stormwater division is one division. At one point, we had 6 engineers and an engineering manager. We have 3 engineers and an engineering manager right now. So we're at half staff. So I wouldn't, we're actively trying to recruit, and we have interviews probably every couple of weeks. But, you know, we've had one open position for 2 years now. So I just want to highlight that next year's CIP for stormwater is not going to be very big because we don't have the staff to implement the projects right now.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's,
It's just a different resourcing issue.
yeah, appreciate that elevating that issue. Hopefully we can solve that before 66 years from now, or even before 2 years from now. Yeah.
I'm just brainstorming here, but and this is a question for everybody here is, you know, the county was out there with their EIFD proposal, which a lot sounds like what
It's
we
very
were saying,
similar.
right? With the offsetting of the incremental tax, and then they've started this new group where I think they're trying to focus on a lot of infrastructure. And again, I'm just brainstorming. Is there have you seen any other examples in the state or in other districts where perhaps we could enter into an agreement with the county that says, you know, well, if you commit to matching some of this, we'll maybe match it too, and you know, is that another approach that? I mean, it sounds like the county wants to do infrastructure. It sounds like, you know, it would cover the entire valley.
I mean, honestly, a lot of these projects seem perfect for the county's EIFD, at least to fund part of it.
And I do know that at one point they were kind of making a call to have some support from some of the other folks that are in the 1%, and not necessarily just rely on the money that comes in to the county to offset some of these projects that are needed. And so I'm just wondering if it might be worthwhile to perhaps initiate those conversations again with the county to say, hey, you know what, we're willing to put some of our incremental to the side, if we can agree that some of these projects will be the target.
Yes, I think that's a good,
Because I just don't know how far it's gotten. Does anybody know? Did it
Haven't heard
die?
anything lately.
All I know is that I think some of the analysis that I've seen, they haven't been able to generate enough increment or revenue to be able to get anything done in less than like 20 years. So, I mean, I think we could entertain the conversation with them and explore it, but I don't think it'd be any distinct advantage for us in terms of getting projects done by going that route. The other thing is that, I mean, I don't know why we wouldn't just sit on scenario 1 for now and then see what happens with the election
Right.
in November, and then, you know, then we'll be in a more decisive position to determine, you know, how aggressive we can get.
but the incremental will
That
go
seems to
up
make more sense to me.
if they build some of these projects.
I agree. Yeah,
Because
it
they're not
wouldn't
gonna
make
build
sense
these projects.
if that thing doesn't pass.
Without.
Right.
We're not going to
doing
get
stormwater,
2/3.
Right, because the developers are not gonna build them.
Yeah.
Director Nelson has some comments.
Oh, yeah, go ahead, Peter.
Hey, so I have a question about the 66-year estimation. Does that include all of the incremental tax, property tax increase in valuation, or is it just what we're doing today?
It includes the incremental growth in stormwater, but not from the other funds.
Okay, so it doesn't put that higher pressure on the other fund rates?
No, it's purely status quo if we did no special decisions and continued on. Just recent comment to note, this doesn't take into any special consideration that if you do these projects, the level of development in the district is likely to respond to the new infrastructure, and you would have growth outside of normal. to go with that. So you might get additional funding depending on the timing of those things. But that would be impossible to predict, and so this is just based on normal growth.
Yeah, so from a 50,000 foot level, I'm just thinking 66 years is, it's not that long to do this type of, huge infrastructure development, thinking in terms of, one director's presence on the board could do 500 million of that over 20 years, right? So it's not out of the question to say that that's a reasonable alternative.
Yeah. Is there, Rick, is there any consideration? I mean, it seems like we have reserves for a reason, right? And this would be a good reason to have reserves, is because you need to build these projects to avert catastrophe. And I'm assuming your reserve targets aren't changing as we go through this 66-year
They
period?
do. They're updated based on the current policy.
But
So
the-
for instance, we have a target based on the size of the operating expenses, so that naturally adjusts as operating
So they're gonna
expenses
go
inflate.
up.
It goes up.
But why wouldn't they go down at least temporarily?
Because we're
In other
doing-
words, we need the money to build the projects, right? So we can't touch this money because it's there just in case we need it in the future. It's like, but that need is now, so let's use it.
So to clarify, it doesn't. The targets go up over time. For stormwater, it's a relatively small target. I want to say it's in the low tens of millions, and we have, let's say, 120 in there now. So this isn't saying that we wouldn't be willing to spend down the reserve for projects. It just says that we're going to stay above the minimum target during that
Right, well,
period of
maybe
time.
maybe if it's in that lower range.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know what it is.
It's pretty minimal because most of our reserve target's based on operating expenses, and this fund doesn't have heavy operating
Okay,
expenses.
fair enough, yeah. I mean, we've been carrying such large reserve balances in this fund. I probably never looked at the target. It's just we've been way over the target for a long time, yeah.
So every year we're adding 15 million, around 15 million.
No, we're spending it. We just have that much to spend on CIP, or we're spending reserves, either one. It was just to say when you take our revenues and you take out what we have to pay for debt service, and we're paying on O&M, what's left over is about 15 million to spend on projects.
Okay, but if we don't spend it, it just adds on until we have a project.
Stays in the
And yeah,
reserves,
the reserves
Okay,
build
'cause
up,
some of
and
these
then
projects are 100 million. So
right, and that's generally what we've done up to this point. Is the reserve got built up, and then we spent down a considerable portion. We've issued debt because we've had large projects recently. So just to cover a few things on the other revenue option, being grants. So there's really three main categories of grants. There are other always offshoot grants, but typically stormwater doesn't have many funding options for grants. There's really only one that is attractable and significant enough to make a real difference, and that comes from FEMA funding. And this isn't FEMA funding in response to disaster to repair what you already have. That's always, well, not always available, but we've seen that in the past. We've tried to get money from that. Tried very hard.
Still trying, I think.
Still trying. But no, this comes from a different program. That's they have three separate sub-programs that are all really in one big bucket with hazard mitigation or similar programs. And so of the three here, there's one that's the most attractive, which is the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. And it can, combined with state funding, which is often there, not always there, but often there, will pay between 75 to 100% of the project. So you're talking the majority, if not all of the project. The trouble is that the amount of money available for this program is tied to disaster declarations. So for instance, if you have a giant wildfire up north, which we've seen, and there's a federal disaster declaration and FEMA gets involved, they will set aside anywhere between 7.5% to 15% of the federal appropriation for those disasters in a set-aside fund for these grants. And then they open up the availability to do that. So the money's only there in response to disasters. And so either that can be very minimal or very significant, and then they get a flood of money, so to speak. All of a sudden, then the federal government feels like they have to spend it very quickly too. So you have to be watching very closely when these are available and jump on the opportunities. In my prior job at Rancho Water, we had responded, for instance, to the Camp fires and the other major fires when there were multi-billions of dollars in disaster declarations. And normally the funding is prioritized to the same types of disasters, wildfires. But there weren't enough projects, and so I'd gotten what was then a $75 million dam replacement, $50 million of that funding for that, and that would have otherwise been impossible. And that was just because of timing. So you need to watch it.
Because of the fires.
Because of the fires.
Amazing.
They otherwise didn't have any projects suspended on. And so last year, also because of disasters, we had about $800 million available in California. And there's usually no project limit, but they prioritize on different policy purposes. So if the money's there, you should go after it. And we are going to, in short order, for the North Cathedral City project, which I think in the CIP was about $10 million, and I know that's probably a little bit higher now with the recent updates. But so we are in this particular case. The one sticky point, well, two, is in order to qualify for any of these programs, the baseline thing that you are telling the government is based on an analysis called the cost-benefit analysis, but it's very FEMA specific, extremely nuanced in how they want the number. And so to do even one analysis for a project to qualify, it's something like $200,000 to $300,000 in consultant costs before you apply. And so you need to be pretty confident it's going to be a good project according to the standards. But if you get it, obviously you're getting almost 100% funding on the project, so it could be well worth it. So we're in the works on that right now for the North Cathedral City project so that we can be eligible when the money becomes available. But you can't just shoot off applications like we can for other grants. The second real caveat, and this is true of any grant, but this is especially pertinent for these, is obviously you cannot begin construction until you get a funding award. So if construction timing is important, you can be almost in an infinite loop here waiting for this funding. And then if you do get the funding, they usually have something like a 3-year requirement to be done with the project. So then you race to try and get it done really, really quickly. So just know that the money comes at a cost, especially if timing is a consideration with the project.
It's worth it, though.
It can be.
And if you have a
Very.
dam just kind of waiting to get redone, perfect.
Even if you blow some money on some projects you don't get, but if you can get one or two of them, it's well worth it.
Yeah, yeah, it can be. So is this going to fund the CIP? No, but you might get a couple of key projects which stand out as priorities, and they're an easy sell to try and take the load off of the financial need. The other two, so if you don't have the hazard mitigation grant, you typically have annual appropriations of what's called the flood mitigation, and that's a nationwide program. We're more competitive there, although it's still competitive. And the last one is open to all disasters, and so it's extremely competitive. And I wouldn't count on getting much money, if any, on that, which is the BRIC funding. Other grants that we've dealt with recently, as you know, in the last few years, congressional earmarks have opened back up. And so there's a limited pool of funding for the House of Representative members, although you get more local attention. And the state senators don't technically have a strict limit that they're working off of, but they're dealing with statewide issues, and so they get a huge list of requests. And so the key thing here is, even if you get political support, you're looking at most $2 to $3 million for the project. So this isn't a big dollar compared to the need, but it's worth pursuing when the options are open. We didn't get this funding in the end when it came down to the final list coming from the senators to request for earmarks for the North Cathedral cities. And then the last one, which we're actively working on now, Victoria and Scott are, the state bonding. So the state puts out to voters a request for authority to issue state bonds, and included in that you have any number of needs. But often I think our projects align with those priorities. Climate change resiliency, disadvantaged community, big infrastructure. And so if you watch this and take advantage of when those come out, you might be able to compete some of these projects might be able to compete for state funding. And so we'll be doing that. The trouble is now the state fiscal situation's deteriorated significantly. So even if you get government support to put these voter initiatives out, the voters now have a sense like there's no money in the state. So passing these gets a lot harder. So that's it on grants. There's really not that much there. Those FEMA ones are the big dollars, and so that's what we'll be looking at. Well, all three we'll be looking at, but that's the one with real hope. And then lastly, just to get into some details on what your tax options are, if you wanted to go through those. I've already covered really the ad valorem. So the real key there is to think that you're asking for a specific authorization to issue up to a certain amount of debt, and that translates into a tax. It is only for debt, and it is only for infrastructure. It does not cover O&M. And so, again, well, I already covered what the equivalent tax would be, the 0.09%, if we were covering debt service on $1.4 billion. The other one, which is probably more likely and more common for special districts, at least on stormwater, are parcel taxes. So if you think something like a CFD, where you're assessing a tax, but we could do it on a district-wide basis, you're just doing something other than ad valorem that grows naturally with assessed valuations. You're doing something like $1 per acre, or a specific benefit like CFDs do, the size of a home, square footage of a home, something like that. So you can pick almost any basis as long as it makes sense and isn't discriminatory as how to assess the tax. I just gave a general sense. If you did $1 per acre, the max amount with as many exempt properties as we have in the service area, you're looking at a little over $200 per acre as an equivalency. This can be done specifically as a CFD, and I only wanted to mention one thing here. As with any CFD, if there's no voters in the area, like a new development area, the vote can be based on landowners, not registered voters. And so if you get development, we can do CFDs if there's going to be a development in an area, if there's specific infrastructure that lines up that's affordable for them. So the one that you probably haven't heard of before, and I'll spend a little bit of time on this just because it's new and novel. Not really new, just new to us. So you can do a stormwater fee, and this is allowed under Prop 218. It still requires a vote, though, but there's a nuance here. So if we did a cost of service, which would be required under that, and said a certain dollar per acre is what is justified, we can go out and issue everyone a Prop 218 notice saying what we're looking for authority to do. You still have your majority protest, so the public has a chance, if there's a majority of property owners that protest that, it stops there. If that continues to go on and the board approves it, you have one more step than what we normally deal with, which is you have to still do a vote. Now here's the interesting piece. You have two ways in which you can choose to do the vote. You can do the standard way, which is a registered voter basis, which is 2/3, or you could do it on landowner, not registered voter, very similar to how you would do an assessment district. And that landowner basis doesn't have to be 2/3, it could be majority only. And not only can it be majority only, but you can weight the vote based on how you're assessing the fee, like numbers of acres would weight each vote. And so it changes the threshold from 2/3 down to significantly less. For instance, if you did a $1 per acre vote, that would mean that those large property owners in the valley would have a very weighted vote if we went that way, rather than just strict registered
If you
voters.
impose a stormwater fee, can it be structured as an ad valorem?
No.
It has to be a
It's
per
a s-
acre?
Per acre. You can raise it $1 per acre over a certain period as you're noticing it, but ad valorem is very strict, as I had described before.
So if you did a stormwater fee for each individual area, correct? So if you did one, you could do one in Mecca, you could do one in Oasis, could you do them that way?
Yes.
Or- Okay, that's how you would do. So you would take a specific area, say you need $50 million or $100 million, and you just impose it on the landowners or the property owners in that area.
Yeah, subject to
So
a
it would
vote,
be-
but yes.
How
Or
would
as
you
a,
structure-
or
how
on a
would you
district-wide
structure-
basis.
Sorry, Rick. How would you structure a cost of service study on that? How does that?
You
look?
would, it would look at the benefits of the project for that area and try and parcel out the geographic area that's benefiting. You'd look at the costs just for that project. You could do it if you wanted to get specific to areas rather than district-wide, but you have option on either. And then lastly, and not that I would recommend it, but just to disclose, it's an option. So the district doesn't have the ability legally to impose a developer impact fee. We usually have the ability to do what we normally consider capacity fees, a certain development charge per meter size or EDU or these kinds of things. But that authority is limited to only water and sewer. It doesn't extend to stormwater, so we can't do capacity fees for stormwater. But the county or another municipality can do developer impact fees, and if you had an agreement with them, they could impose it and then pass it on. It's very complicated and it raises a lot of issues, but it's theoretically an option. And that's it for the presentation. The real need here was if there was any interest in coming up with more more options, if we wanted to direct the discretionary growth in the taxes, that will impact the budget and cost of service studies, so we should reflect that. If it's let's wait and see till how the November vote is before we do anything else, then that's good to know. Or if you wanted more information specifically, then this would be a good time to let us know.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some wisdom in waiting for the November vote. You know, I don't know if who's even behind that, Victoria. I mean, do we know who's behind? Who put that on the ballot?
I can get a list. I
It's-
don't know offhand.
Yeah,
It's-
we should maybe
It's
learn
intrinsically
more
government sponsored at some level of government.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Make it easier to raise taxes. You know, I mean, I think we should do what we can. You know, continue to build the projects we can afford to build until we find what our preferred alternative is.
I think we also kind of need to know, out of all those projects, what is the starting ones? I mean, when you talk about the Mecca and Oasis and North Shore, and you talk about Desert Hot Springs or Thousand Palms, what are the ones that start those projects? Because you can't tell because you can't. Maybe the fifth project doesn't do you any good unless you build the first project.
Okay. So, what we did is we took all the projects that were listed in the master plans that we did for that we did back in 2014. So, we have our the current projects that we're working on, the big ones, Thousand Palms, Flood Control Channel, the North Cathedral City project, and they're the ones that we have listed in our 5-year CIP. I'm not exactly sure what that total comes up to, but it's that top half there. And then you get into Mecca, North Shore, Oasis, Valley Floor, those projects. Those were more developer funded or driven type projects. So those we don't even have a design specifically for or a schedule for or anything. Those are really kind of up in the air. So really the ones we're focusing in on are the ones that, have a more specific title there.
Could you say we're focused more on areas that are already developed?
Yeah, that
From an
are
urban standpoint, rather than areas that remain predominantly agricultural?
Yeah, we could say that. I mean, but it's also just it's also bringing some of the existing facilities, like the East Side Dike, up to the 100-year standards.
I guess what I'm trying to get a sense of is how did we focus on these first rather than Mecca, North Shore, or Oasis Valley Floor? Was there a driver to that?
Yeah, if I may, just looking at what we have here, we've got North Indio obviously is under construction.
Right.
Coachella Valley Stormwater Improvements about to be completed. The CVM SHCP is a commitment we have with the Multi-Species Habitat Conservation Plan. We're working through North Cathedral City, obviously, is a
Right.
priority. East Side Dyke realignment is required. It is in the urbanized areas near Terra-Lago. And then we have Thousand Palms Channel, obviously something we're working on land acquisition right now, which is in Thousand Palms community. And then we have Thousand Palms Flood Control Project, which is the ultimate tie-in point for everything north of the 10 that confluences it or brings it into the existing Coachella Valley Stormwater Channel. And then we have
Start Rob.
Yeah, so I was just wondering how we come up with these priorities versus starting over here or here.
Yeah, these are all, so these are all ones that are relatively urbanized. There's Kings Road, Martinez Canyon, which are out near the Oasis area. That came up a few years ago that the board asked us to concentrate on. One of them is where the golf course,
Ladera.
Ladera is recently built, and the county's working on improving that roadway that's right in front of Ladera, Lemon Blossom. So we kind of bumped that up a little bit. But everything else out here has been pushed out to the ends based off of our master planning and was originally planned to be tied with land development and how urbanization was expanding.
Okay, safe.
So
Thanks.
we need to come up with something, and I think that's why we're all here, because would it be fair to say that the majority, when the desert was being built over the last 60 or 70 years, that a lot of the restrictions on where you could build weren't there. And so people built in different areas that didn't have the flood control, okay? And then we came in as there was problems, and we figured out ways to protect those homes. And we're still continuing to do that right now. Right?
Yeah.
Right. So a lot of the areas that were on all these projects, there would have never been homes there if they were under the current guidelines on where you could put homes.
They would have been expensive to build.
That's correct, because the developer would have been charged with funding those projects,
That's correct.
which may or may have not been done. And so that's, I think, the argument that Caslo has, is that, you know, we have to find ways to, because you basically, what you're trying to say is if we put these all on developers, you may never have flood control in certain areas in the valley because of it, because they'll never come. The development will never come because of the costs associated with building stormwater
Right.
facilities.
Right. I guess I just, until that development comes or until there's a realistic project, it's kind of status quo. I don't think we're gonna move forward. They're not gonna. And so I guess that my point is, I don't want us to be making a lot of decisions that impact the funds for this fund, or making decisions to reallocate funds that impact domestic or sanitation without understanding that the top list, those are real projects. Those, and the others are yet to be determined.
Yeah, and I'm fine with that in general. I just would hate to get to a point where we don't have the funding for it. And because we don't have the funding for it, then we put it on the developer and kill projects. So I'm okay with, obviously, we won't move on those projects until it's needed, because there's gonna be development. I mean, that in general makes sense to me. You know, I think a lot of times if we don't have the funding and we say, hey, developer, when all of a sudden you have a few extra $1 million worth of infrastructure that we need you to build for us and then feed over to us, I think that becomes hard. So as long as we have a fund that allows us to have some flexibility, I think, and we have some sort of sense of priority based on what's really happening, it all seems fair.
I mean,
Yeah,
if we just look at that top few projects, that's probably gonna take us 20, 25 years to get through those. So we're not looking at anything further down.
You're talking about the top half of the top part?
The 670 million in that first
Oh,
section.
the whole top.
Yeah, I mean,
Oh, yeah, that's a lot.
that's a huge number.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah,
I mean,
and
I don't want
I'll
to
say it's
mislead
a
you
little
by
bit-
saying, yeah, we've got reserve projects, so if something were to happen in Mecca, and we'd have to run down there and do $12 million. Well, okay, what of the top part is not going to get done because now we're adding something from the bottom?
And I think that's what we need to decide.
Well, right now, the decision is to go with the top projects, unless you come and tell us something else.
I think that's what we're trying to do. I think the fact that we're meeting here is because we're trying to get a sense of how all this funding's being spread out. And
Right.
whether we have a sense that it should, be moved somewhere else or not. I don't,
There's not enough money to do everything.
we know that, and that's
Yeah.
why we need to have a sense of priority.
Mr. Nelson has some comments.
Okay.
Yeah, so I like these group projects. I know that the Thousand Palms flood control project was kind of grouped in with North Indio, and it was determined, after we gave it some additional thought, is that hey, we can't do the Thousand Palms and then just dump all that water into a project of North Indio that's not built, right? We need to have a place for the water to go. So some of these. We can plan them and try and get money as it goes forward. But then there's always that reality check of how do we move the water once we get it corralled. For example, that the drop structure there at Avenue 58 there in Thermal was really important to get that dialed in, because you looked at, all of Mecca getting flooded out if once we had the North Indio project in. So it's kind of up to David and Kerry on the engineering side is to, tell us, some of those priorities as well. But, it's good to have them grouped up here, and I like that top group, and we should keep working towards that.
Yeah, just kind of for perspective, the Travertine Point, if it's $80 million and 5,000 homes, that's $16,000 a home. Just for the flood control part. There's a lot of other things they're going to need infrastructure-wise too. It's a big number.
Yep.
Big number.
And growing.
Mhm.
And that's today's, Darrell. That's if you decided to
Yeah.
pull the trigger today.
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to say is that you won't get any projects if the requirement today is for a developer to put those in. You won't get any. That's what I'm trying to say. So we're just trying to figure that out.
Right. Otherwise, this is going to take about 70 years. And that would fund the ones on the bottom as well. So that's just to put it in perspective. It will take some time, but there is funding to do the whole list. But the big question, at least from staff's perspective, was if 70 years seems way too long, then we need to look at other options. Otherwise, that's about how long naturally this is going to happen.
I think it is too long. I mean, I'm curious to see if that initiative passes on November, and maybe we can talk to some PR consulting people and see what the temperature is on doing something.
That's all I had to throw. Any other
Yeah.
questions? This is your last chance to ask me.
Yeah, no, it's good. It's good. I appreciate it.
Okay.
I'm assuming all your spreadsheets that show the work behind these numbers are going to be left behind.
Carla is well trained.
They're not going to disappear.
Yeah. So I have a question on the list here. Is in respect to that area of benefit thought, where you can go to certain home landowners in that area and put a special have them vote that special taxes. I mean, could you organize this list by those geographic areas as well, or maybe it already is. But kind of thinking in terms of if you went out for a Prop 218 for a landowner assessment, one of those last options, could you format this project list according to geographic area?
Sure.
In a sense, it is already kind of in the bottom part.
Yeah, but you can tell on the top part what's what mostly.
I was just gonna say the short answer is yes.
Yes.
Yeah, because
Oh, I'm sorry, I turned it off.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion because I was looking at like Kings Road Regional Stormwater Facility for the Oasis area, Martinez Canyon Regional Storm Facility for the Oasis area. Those are big projects, and I don't have a sense of, you know, the area that it covers. So I think it'd be a good idea.
Yeah, there's a distinct watershed and a tributary or an area that
Yeah.
gets impacted by it. That'd be pretty simple, I would imagine.
Yeah.
Yeah, pull it up on your GIS, and kind of map out generally where the acreages are.
It's nice to see the North Indio Regional just 100 grand.
Yeah, isn't that good? Yeah.
That's just to pay for the ribbon that you're going to use when you do the ribbon.
That's for the money. No, I'm kidding. That'll be for the Lomar after.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, good. It's good information. You know, I think if that thing passes in November, maybe we set up another meeting to see. Looking at Rick now.
Oh, looking at Carla.
Yeah, maybe then that would be a good time to reconsider our options, because that does make a big change. Good. We have no further business, no public comment? One last chance? No? All right, with that, we are adjourned.